Hello and welcome to Exchanges for another week. We are about 5 to 6 days away from a federal election here in Australia, so I decided to do a bit of a special today on Exchanges and get in a political expert. And who better than none other than Kieran Gilbert, the chief political editor at Sky News, to really dive into what he is seeing, what his team has been seeing on the floor. Before we do get into that Exchanges, please remember that we are now sponsored here at Exchanges by More, a lifestyle by design app designed to help you out there get the ultimate returns that you can from your property and your overall wealth portfolio. Please go and have a look at More. It's moorr.com.au and they will help you through with everything in between. But without any further ado, here is Kieran Gilbert and our special on the Australian election. Kieran Gilbert, welcome to Exchanges.
Evan, hi.
I wanted to get you on because it's an absolutely amazing period of time that we are going through an Australian election that has probably been met with the most muted response I think I've ever seen. Would you sort of suggest that's probably true?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's definitely that's the overall vibe and view of the election campaign. I think there are pockets, though, that are really motivated and mobilized. For example, I think about the protests against the offshore wind farms or localized issues like the nuclear plants that the coalition's planning. So various pockets super mobilized, or like on the superannuation taxes proposed by Chalmers now shelved because of lack of support. Again, there are constituencies that are very energized, but I think overall you're right. There's been a bit of a switch off, and as a result of that, quite a soft vote. A larger percentage of voters undecided till very late in the piece.
So you interestingly mentioned those mobilised sort of voters, because the other thing that you're sort of mentioning there is that at the moment, policy is pretty thin, and particularly the economic policy and the fiscal policy that's been put up by both sides of the divide are fascinating. Do you think that's also because the electorate is just not listening? Is it the fact that the housing policy that's coming around that seems pretty much almost on the fly by both of them, is that the electorate switched off and they therefore don't actually know what the electorate wants?
It's a bit of the chicken and the egg, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sometimes we think, well, is it because they're not listening, or is it because leaders aren't saying, I'm going to grab the mantle and lead some significant reform? You think about the tax changes, dealing with bracket creep in the short term. Peter Dutton was asked about tax. He says an aspiration is to link it and to index it to inflation down the track, but it's an aspiration, it's not a plan. And it was sort of an afterthought, really.
Yeah.
So I think in many respects, I'm surprised that what has come out of the coalition has been delivered so late and sporadically. Now, it might work. Maybe they pull off a win next week on May the 3rd. At the moment, though, the polls suggest not. My feeling is that leaving it so late, it really does defy the old adage that John Howard used to say, you can't fatten the pig on market day. And I think for coalition supporters, unfortunately, that's what the opposition has been trying to do in this campaign.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that seemed like a thought bubble, the fact that they finally woke up to the idea that this bracket creep problem is there. Then they was wedged with the fact that they're obviously blocking the proposed change to the lowest tax bracket from 16 to 14% over the next 2 years. I want to go back to housing then, because housing has probably been the biggest policy discussion throughout this campaign. You've got the Labor Party that is offering their 5% deposit with their, rent to buy and their other schemes. You've now got the coalition that are offering the possibility of using, interest deductions for your own personal home, which is a fascinating product in itself. The withdrawal of $50,000 or up to $50,000 of your super. Why is this time around housing such the election lightning rod? It always is, but more so than it has probably in the last sort of 4 or 5 elections.
Yeah, I'm in Brisbane today, and I can tell you, just talking to voters, seeing the politicians door knocking. This is the number two issue, probably linked to the number one issue of cost of living. The next generation are struggling to get into the housing market, onto the property ladder. So I get what they're trying to do. Fundamentally, though, whoever wins, as you know, they've got to deal with that supply side issue. They've got to get more houses built. They've got to get the labor force sorted in building, and they've really got to boost that side of the equation. That's fine, these other measures to win votes for first home buyers, and I get it. I get the politics, but the fundamental equation is if you're going to make a difference, they've just got to get the planning processes more streamlined, whether it be through a, a council with the local government and states. That's got to happen. Otherwise, we will just be on this merry-go-round for the next few electoral cycles.
Yeah, and that's why I asked that first question about do they understand the electorate, because this is all demand side politics, right? It's all about the here and now. How can I get the vote? Which is offering demand policies that allow people to withdraw their super or only have a 5% deposit, and the government takes on the risk of the other 15% for mortgage lenders, etc. Why is this also why we're at this point where this does feel like it's quite a lackluster campaign because reform just doesn't
Yeah.
exist, right?
Well, handouts, yeah, exactly. This handout over that handout, this tax cut over that excise reduction. The government would argue that it is dealing with bracket creep to an extent with that tax cut that they announced, albeit just a top-up tax cut, as they've called it. The Prime Minister argues that the childcare reforms, that's a big legacy item that he's looking at, a big productivity boost. But other than that, and you got the coalition with the nuclear energy program, which would be a major structural shift in our economy, but haven't really owned it. That's the thing. It's been Albanese that's been at a nuclear proposed site for one of the power plants, not the opposition leaders. So this is the dynamic right now, and I'm not sure it's playing that well for Peter Dutton because he's been forced to sort of back away from some of the commitments he's made, like with the work from home for public servants. That was to be quite frank, a debacle for them. It blew up immediately with focus groups and people, voters just saying, look, what are you doing here? It's just a signal to the private sector because since COVID, a lot of people have structured it into their lives, not just a convenience issue, but it actually is a fundamental cost of living one as well when you talk about the reduction in commute times and so on.
Yeah, and then you've also got the productivity commissioner who this year came out and said that hybrid working has been proven to be probably the highest level of productivity with regards to work in Australia. So I agree with you on that one as well, which was again this movement on the fly. I mean, in the last we're recording this the week before the election, but we've just seen in the last 24, 48 hours that, on Tuesday, Peter Dutton was asked about the EV vehicle tax breaks that he supported, and then 24 hours later, he doesn't. Is this again why, you get this question that particularly the government's pinning on Peter Dutton, which is that you can't trust his position because he flip flops, and that the cuts are coming no matter where you think they might not be. They could therefore rock up on the day.
Yeah. This, I think this goes to sort of a fundamental issue here. And we'll know the election result next week. And I don't want to sort of preempt it because the polls have been wrong in the past. And maybe Peter Dutton ends up being the political genius that pulls off a majority government and wins. I mean, I've been surprised by other things in the past in politics, and I wouldn't rule that out next week. What I would say, though, is at the moment it doesn't look like that's where it's headed. And there is a difference between what Peter Dutton's done as a sort of a smaller target. He's not a small target because you've got the nuclear plan, but he's tried to keep it focused on the negatives of the government, the cost of living issues, the reduction in the standard of living, 8% reduction in standard of living, the greatest fall among developed nations. And if he could have kept it just on that, that's fine. Maybe he was going to be more successful. Maybe he will still be. Who knows? But I think the problem is he hasn't had the same level of tempo, say, of Tony Abbott did. Tony Abbott, when he was opposition leader, he was criticised for the three-word slogans and the mantra that he said: "Stop the boats, cut the tax," and so on. But he was out there day in day out. We face media all the time. No one could say he didn't have the miles in the legs when it came to that sort of scrutiny. And the point I'm getting to is I don't know whether Peter Dutton's done that sufficiently over the last 3 years to get him up to match fitness so that you're not getting these backflips, these statement one day, backflip the next, the uncertainty around it. Again, maybe he pulls it off. Maybe the times suit him as the strong leader, as he's been through the 20 plus years of his time in the public office. But right now, the polls suggest that's not what's going to happen next Saturday.
So then that brings us to the next sort of discussion. Let's say that the Albanese government is on track to come back to power, but there is still signs that a minority is there, which brings in what you just spoke about before. And I do want to pick it up, which is about scrutiny. And scrutiny has been a big discussion point in the election campaign so far, particularly around the independents. I'll get to somebody like the member for Kooyong. I'll also sort of talk about what's going on with the member for Wentworth and what's there. But let's assume that all things somewhat remain equal, that, you know, the Albanese government does fall into a minority government. Who is in line, in your view, to actually be part of it? Because I'm going to give you a magical number. Let's say the Albanese government gets 70 or 71 seats. What happens then? Because clearly the Greens believe that they're the party. But where do the Teals, the true independents, and those play into a scenario where Albanese gets 70, 71 seats? He needs obviously 76 to have the government. You could argue that maybe one of the independents goes in as the speaker, so he realistically needs 75. How will that play out if that was to come about?
Well, there won't be any formal agreement. Anthony Albanese is still scarred by the time of being the manager of government business, the leader of the House during the Gillard period and the independence of Oakeshott and Windsor. He's not going to do a formal agreement with the Greens or anyone like Julia Gillard did with Bob Brown. That's not going to happen. I know that it's raised as a possibility, but he's still scarred by how bad that was, that period for Labor. Being seen to compromise on their values, their policies, their direction. You just can't do that and survive in politics. I've been talking to some senior cabinet ministers the last few days. I know that there's talk, and you're right to raise it, the prospect of a minority government, but their feeling at the moment is if it's tracking the way it is now, this is all going to end
Moot?
up being a moot point
Yeah,
because
okay.
it could they could well end up with a majority on the night. Maybe not. As I say, we don't want to be definitive. Polls have been wrong. Politicians have been wrong. Journalists have been wrong in previous cycles. So I'm not going to state something unequivocally, but that's certainly what I'm hearing from inside the Labor government. They're doing their very best to avoid hubris at this point.
So that will mean that therefore the discussions at the moment, I mean, we've seen in the last week or so that the Greens have asked for a green paper, just like the blue paper and the red paper that is put out by Treasury. Are you suggesting that even so, the Greens are dealing themselves out, even though there's a suggestion, particularly in where you are right now, Brisbane, that the Greens are actually seeing increased points in the 3 seats that they hold up there?
Yeah, they could do. The state election would suggest otherwise, that the
Mm.
Greens are a bit more on the nose. Maybe they hold Griffith, held by Max Chandler Mather. I think the other two are looking probably likely to go to either the Liberal Party and Ryan, Labor or Liberal here in the seat of Brisbane. I think that's probably where I would suggest the predictions are at the moment. But uh, the Greens, I think, have struggled in a way because they've sort of got off their main game. They got off the issue of environment and the thing that's driven a lot of action towards their party recently in recent electoral cycles have been climate change. And I think it's fine to have positions on other policies, but when it becomes their main issue, they risk they risk their political identity, I think, and that's happened. We've seen it at the state level. I think there's a real risk that will happen in Brisbane come the federal election.
So that's also interesting because that brings me to, I mean, you're obviously alluding to the issues that have been around what's going on in the Middle East, what's also been going on in other parts of the world that they've brought back to Australia. We therefore then need to bring into what has clearly been the biggest impactor, in my view anyway, on the election so far, which is the administration over in Washington and how much this has played out. I mean, some people are referring to this as, Anthony Albanese's Tampa issue that Howard had with regards to the Liberation Day changes and what it's done has meant that incumbency has really picked up. You need the security. What is the discussion that you're hearing from both the government and the opposition about dealing with Washington and the fact that clearly what is going over there will be front and center for the next 3 years because they are doing things that we haven't basically seen in almost in a century, living memory with regards to having tariffs, but also an administration that is so clearly against globalization and particularly this, the Asian region, which we are, what are we having to do going forward with an administration that's now clearly no longer as much in our interests as we thought they were?
This is the huge issue, the backdrop for the whole campaign. You're right. This level of uncertainty that voters have because of the turbulence on the markets for superannuation and so on. So it's shifted the dynamic. It's shifted the political equation where at the end of last year, incumbents were struggling to be re-elected.
Yeah.
Now there's a view that people are gravitating towards incumbents, like say the Liberal government in Canada with Mark Carney, or with the polls improving for the Albanese government locally. Whoever wins, this is going to be the defining issue of the times and for the next 3 years to navigate the security umbrella and the alliance, which remains so pivotal to our nation and our future. But then do the diplomatic dance with the Trump administration to make it operational on that in that sense, as difficult that as that might be, without then also jeopardizing other trading and alliance relationships in our region.
Yeah, because that brings China right into that question. That's exactly the answer that, is one of the things that maybe not as influential as he was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, but Peter Navarro has always fingered Australia for is our over reliance in his view and our backdoor relationship with China going forward. Has that also come into what you've been seeing from the electorate, hearing from people, hearing from both sides of government that the relationship with China now becomes even more delicate, considering that they are a major trading partner. Our major security partner is trying to hit them as hard as they can, and we are being sandwiched in the middle.
It's not more delicate. It is just always delicate. That's the thing. That's the reality. And I think it has been for several years now. I wouldn't say it's more. I would say it's just as it's sort of this is the reality. This is the modern balance that Australia has to sort of navigate with our largest trading partner also being a strategic rival of our biggest security partner. This is the dynamic that the Morrison government um, faced and was damaged by politically locally with the group of, the cohort, a large cohort, more than 1 million Australians of Chinese heritage swung dramatically against Morrison at the last election. I'll be intrigued to see what happens in 2025 for the Dutton-led opposition. Have they been able to neutralise that issue to say that they could also keep things on an even keel between Canberra and Beijing if they're elected on the 3rd of May?
Yeah, and I don't think they have. I mean, I'm allowed to put my opinion out there. I know obviously you can't do that as much considering what you do, but I would argue that it's clear that it's still not there, and you can hear that from the Chinese ambassador and from Chinese officials that they are worried about what a Dutton-led government would mean and whether or not we go back to a Morrison era, considering where Dutton was sitting at that time in the Morrison government. I also then need to come back to what we started at this, which is around reform. Let's assume that the Albanese government is re-elected. It isn't necessarily and hasn't been re-elected on any form of major policy, changes or platform. What does the next 3 years therefore look like? What does the 3 years that the government therefore has leading into 27, 28, and what it will be? Because we are getting closer and closer towards the structural change. I mean, you talked about before about the movement at the bottom end of the tax bracket. What's been forecasted by most major consultancy firms is that by 2031, the majority of Australians will go into the 37 tenths bracket anyway. The majority of Australians that are going to be retiring have a superannuation balance that's well below expectations. What is going to trigger that next 3 years to actually finally have the debate that the 2030s we are going to be forced to hit structural reform rather than sort of doing it now when we actually probably need to talk about it?
Yeah, there's going to be a day of reckoning, of course, when you look at the deficits and the structural imbalance in the budget. They have to get to a point where that significant, substantial, and in many respects, the sort of generational reform that you're talking about is going to have to be delivered. The next 3 years, there'll be a big focus, of course, on energy as the government tries to ensure that energy rollout happens more smoothly and to try and smooth out the fluctuations in price in that sense. So much rests on what happens internationally, as you rightly point out, with the Trump administration and the flow-on effect through tariffs and so on. But you're right, at some point that longer term structural shift is going to be a part of our political discourse and economic debate again, as the reality hits that we do have to get the budget back into a more sustainable and onto a more sustainable footing over the medium to longer term.
Is it the electorate? Is it us that actually has to wake up to the fact that we're going to have to accept that politicians are going to have to tell us things that we don't want to hear?
Well, as I said at the start, it's the whole chicken and the egg. If you've
Yeah.
got leaders that are going to embrace it, the electorate, the field of dreams analogy, if you build it, they will come. There's John Howard in 1998 took a risk with the GST, had a near-death experience politically, but he got there and served 4 terms, won 4 elections, and that was the significant reform that at the time was seen as a backflip, but I think to this day, most economists and beyond would say it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, but then we have obviously Bill Shorten in 2019 with the unlosable election taking reform, maybe not as hard the next time around, but we've seen that the GST era and the John Howard era, or even let's go back further, the sort of the Hawke, Keating, Howard eras of the 80s and 90s where reform could happen, can't happen now. Is that also again the electorate, social media, the rise and rise of independence, the rise and rise of focus groups? Is that why we can't do it like we used to?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that there are other flaws with the 2019 approach, maybe putting too many things into that basket, and picking too many fights instead of having one substantial set of reforms as opposed to then trying to have a whole sweep. And then politically, I think they butchered it. There was hubris there, and that we saw that on election day back in 2019. I disagree with the way others have characterized it and saying it's impossible. It's not impossible. With the right leadership, the right strategy, and the right focus, it's definitely still achievable in this country. Voters are not dumb.
I would agree. Kieran, I'm not going to ask you to forecast the future because I don't think that's fair. So I'll skip over the elections coming on May 9th. It will be a fascinating 3 years. So I'm going to ask you the question that I ask everybody on the Exchanges podcast, which is, if you're in charge for just one day, what would you do?
Well, I would ensure that there's transparency for all candidates, and I know, having done many debates over the years, political candidates will come on when they're trying to get into Parliament. Sometimes MPs, when they're in, don't share that same willingness to come on and answer questions. When you like a coverage that you've received from a certain media outlet or publication, you should still engage. John Howard, as I mentioned earlier, he had the guts to show up, deliver on reform, and I think the same could be said for Bob Hawke, Paul Keating. I would say Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd, Tony Abbott. They would engage across the board politically, regardless of what publication, what television station or radio station. I think MPs, independent, green or otherwise, should always engage. If I was in charge for a day, I'd make sure that everyone showed up and answered questions.
And I think that is exactly what we will hope for the future. Kieran Gilbert, thank you so much for joining Exchanges.
Thanks, Evan. Cheers, mate.
What an episode. Big talking points. And as you can hear from Kieran, it's going to be quite an interesting night on Saturday. He clearly wants to point out that there is a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't normally get to see. And that's what I also really wanted someone like him to get out there. So a big thank you to Kieran, and a big thank you to you, as always, for getting on and listening to the Exchanges podcast. It's fantastic to bring these for you. And for that, don't forget, we do have an email. It's exchanges@evanlucas.com.au. If you've got any thoughts, guests, or questions that you'd like me to put to those guests going forward. Also, don't forget, please, down below or wherever you're listening to this, please hit subscribe, or actually just do some form of rating, because at the moment we're doing really well, but we are trying to get bigger guests and I need to continue to grow. So if you can, please remember to do that. But until next week, thank you again for listening and good luck at the election coming up.